this is day 2 of GDC. This was a very packed one. Not only did I go to a bunch of talks, I caught up with, or hung out with a friend of mine in Seattle, but also I hung out with some new people from a very legendary game of Uno. So, there's a lot to cover. As always, I am keeping my card collection over right next to the camera that you can't see. I will count that when it's relevant. But I guess the best place to start would be the talks. Now, actually all of my talks today were VFX, which means technical art. So shaders, essentially. Technical art is the difference between graphics programming and technical art is a bit of a weird one because there's a lot of overlap, but technical art you have to care more about things like how to add plugins to Maya or Blender or stuff like that, and caring about, you're basically part tools programmer, but you're also making shaders and such. Which frankly, I think that's more, based on some of these talks, it's kind of more what I'm interested in some ways. So I'm thinking about maybe trying to pivot to focus in my skill set in that direction, because that's where a lot of my experience lies. But that's a whole thing for another time. I think what's important is we start from the beginning. So, my first talk was later in the day. I got to decompress some more after how tired I was this morning, which was great, so necessary. But I went to this talk. It's about water in Diablo 4. And the gist of it is that it's a lot of clever uses of deferred rendering and good tool creation to make it so artists can tinker with the parameters to make the shorelines and foam look good and keep track of things like motion and flow and add that into your G buffer. And a lot of cool manipulation of things like sine waves and whatnot. So they open up with talking about deferred water. Basically, the parts of the G buffer, there's two parts. There's a refraction buffer, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then it's G buffer, which is albedo, normals, roughness, which is like a extra kind of normal. It's for like detailed highlights. And these are combined to form a G buffer, which you can sample and do a bunch of cool stuff with. And then you can use that for lighting calculations, hence deferred. Of oceans, they use basically a bunch of clever interpolation. They take textures, you get the distance from the center to the edges, and then you smooth step. You combine a bunch of smooth step values to create waves, which you can then combine together and subtract the values to get your foam and all this other cool stuff. Then you can mess around with it to make it really good. And for deep water, they use Gerstner waves, which are height-based. They use procedural flow to make it look and react to, make it look good out in the ocean. For rivers, they have a flow texture to help map out where water should go and at what speed should go. They can simulate forces In fact, they basically can take the player interactions and enemy interactions and spell interactions, put them to a texture, and then apply the lighting changes to the water so the water can ripple and react when the player does things, which helps it feel more like actual water. They have to stylize it. I say stylize. They say minimize the distracting highlights. I would call that stylization. So they stylize it by highlights that are too glaring. They just edit the normals to look away. They use mip mapping for shadows inside the water. By using the sun direction to offset the UVs to create little distorted shadows in the mip maps in the water. They use a lot of procedural puddles. They have ice, which looks like it's reflecting by parallaxing. Or it looks like it's like, stuff that's in the water where you parallax the stuff beneath it. They have snow, which uses a tessellation shader. What a surprise, they're using height maps, which apparently I've learned from Steve Thompson, who we'll talk about later. That's very common usage for tessellation shaders, which is funny because tessellation shaders are not that used that often. They're used more than geometry stage, which is forbidden, just to put it mildly. You don't travel to the geometry stage. They actually add frenzel to the snow by they use the dot product to find the edge, essentially. It's like a very simple form of edge detection. Like they use the normals and compare it to the view direction, so it's like pure normal edge detection. And then they make it more strong by editing the contrast so that the edges are really stark, so you can get strong highlights. It's like a small thing, but if you pay attention to it, it adds a lot. It's a neat little detail. They also have the ability to change the color of the water in some ways to respond to hell tide, which is where everything looks like it's like the water is turning red with blood. To signify things are harder. They use ray marching for clouds. Pretty cool. And that's the gist of it. So a lot of cool usage of deferred rendering here. And clever tooling as well, which is neat. It's cool to see, people who are very skilled find these clever solutions to things. I like these kinds of talks. The next one is building your own. So there's something interesting about both of this one and the next one is that because tech artists aren't expected to have the same familiarity with, say, linear algebra, for example, as graphics programmers, they'll often, like in the other talk, the first one I just explained, the speaker sits down and explains what normalizing a vector means and what a dot product means, and which for a lot of tech artists and artists in general, they might not necessarily know that, and it's really helpful. And I think it's a great introductory overview for the kind of techniques you can do in tech art that's really accessible. I think it's a good talk. It's a really good talk, especially if you want to learn more about shaders. I think you won't understand all of it, obviously. There's a bunch of terms that you just won't know. But I think it's a good primer. This one, I think, is even better primer in some ways, because it explains. It's not a better primer, actually. There's still a lot of terms you would need to know, but it's a cool one. Because it's all about building a custom particle system all in one shader, which you might want because it makes things really fast and really modular, and you can tool things for your different games, which is super useful. It's by Ben. is all done in shader graph in Unity, because he's a Unity person. And basically the gist of it is you add to an ID, you basically make a mesh, which is just quads. So you statically allocate your particles as quads, just a collection of quads. You assign them a vertex color, and you use that for IDing which particle is which. And then you implement things like billboarding, animation, movement, using the IDs as the random IDs, the random vertex colors, to tell them which, based off of which IDs, how should they respond, to do to randomize motion. So you can randomize direction of motion, or the spread, like what's the variance in their spread, how are they animating, can you make them shrink and grow, rotate them. You didn't add forces, you didn't add rotation, you didn't add flip booking, all the things you would want out of a particle system. Like, it's a very straightforward particle system, the kind of way you use out of the box in Unity. And you can easily extend it, which is what's nice about it. And you can make cool things, like you make smoke. And I'm going to use it to make an explosion. I'm curious to see how well it would work for. I think it'd be great, because it could be great. I think the problem would be if you had an explosion, you might deallocate particles and move them elsewhere. But it's also instantaneous effect. So once the particles are deactivated, you just can use those same set of quads over and over and over and over. It's pretty fast, and I think it'd be great for our use case in combined arms. And at least it could be a cool exercise, if nothing else. So I would love to give that a try. The PDF, he has a website, it's on his PDF, he has a YouTube channel. I think I'll have to check that out. I could go more nitty gritty, but I don't see the point of that, because again, you can find nitty gritty online. I use this more as like, I think it's a good overview of just how this works. And something interesting too is most of this, I believe, is in the vertex shader, which in general, vertex shaders are faster because there's less vertices and pixels. General rule, vertex stage faster than the fragment stage for this reason. In fact, that's going to become really relevant later down the line for the foliage talk. Really cool talk. I love it. I'm super excited to get into that. Here's a little detour. It's about Venba. Venba is you may have heard of this game. It was a little indie darling from last year. It was a game about an Indian family cooking Indian food, and a boy reconnecting with his mom. And a lot of people liked it. I never played it myself, but the process of it I found interesting. This talk was short, but basically, and I got here a little late, but the first part was ideation, it sounded like, and I think like the ideation part is so self-explanatory in a way that I don't feel like I missed much there. But basically, they tried to get funding, and the problem they had is that because their game is hard to compare against the market, it's an out there game concept of what if you made a puzzle game about figuring out how to make the recipes with limited information. It's not a cooking mom or anything like that. You can't just compare it, and the publishers just didn't seem to know what to do with it. Like, even with a limited budget, they were worried, like, what's the marketability of this? It just completely were just thrown off. It sounded like they just did not know what to do with this. And it highlights that if you're making something weird, and even, let's be honest, it's novel in the sense that we tend to not have games that are like this deep in the weeds. Sorry, I see a little bug over there. But most are not this deep in the, you don't get games that are this like slice of life, exploring this specific culture. There are some games like that, but they're all indie games because publishers really don't know what to do with it. They don't have and I think when you don't have an idea of what to do with something, you err on the side of conservatism. You don't want to risk it, unless you get more proof, which is important because they make a trailer and they get more buzz, they get more traction, they get more, and they learn to overcome, they're not taking it too personally, and then they start coming and they get a publisher because they've proven it through interest that, oh, actually there is a market for this. Which, again, that's importance for independent games. You're cultivating and finding your own market because you're going somewhere where the water hasn't been tread, so there's no guidebook, and people are going to doubt you, and you need to find ways to convince them, and it's going to, like, showing that the audience exists. And the thing that they struggled with, the guy struggled with, I did not write his name, unfortunately, but he struggled basically with a kind of perfectionism and, perfect representation, needs to represent everything about everything. He should leave nothing out, everything should be included, all sorts of cuisines from everywhere, needs to talk about everything, and it just became too overwhelming, and so he just was like, okay, let's focus in, let's give this more focus. And he started simplifying things enough where the structure of the recipe is preserved in real life. It's based off real recipes, but they're simplified enough that they're approachable. And then he starts obscuring them for the puzzle solving and the visual novel elements and stuff. And I think it's an important lesson that, you need focus. You can't talk about everything. You can't be everything to everybody. And having focus makes you a better game, and I think a more resonant game. And it worked. It was successful at launch, and I think there's a great concept from CJDX called signal words, where when you have an intention, you want to look for words that reflect that intention that you're going out, your signal words. And he wanted, something about reconnecting with his mom, and he wanted to make people feel that, think about their own connection to their mothers. And so he kept hearing stuff like, I should go call my mom, which is kind of the intention, not specifically get people to call their mothers, but to be about that connection. And so it highlights that, oh, this resonates. It's just signaling that. And what's interesting is that it's mostly a non-Indian audience playing it, but they're still able to connect because a lot of our lives have things that resonate, that are wider and more universal experiences. And I think that's something to bear in mind with any creation of art. Resonance. You can write not just outside your own perspective, but your own perspective can resonate with other people besides yourself, and that's important to recognize. Okay, then we get to Arc Survival Evolved. I'll keep this. I'll try to be quick. There's a lot of details here that I don't think I'll be able to get to. So basically they wanted to make reactive foliage. Like get trees to react when you brush past them. And you have this problem where if you actually do this, you could try to do this on the CPU. But you lose out all these optimizations you get from Unreal 5 on the GPU, like Nanite, a tool that I think it's good for high fidelity meshes. And so they asked the question, how do you animate? How do you do animation purely on the GPU? And they do a clever thing where they map the bones to a texture and the tips to the texture, and then they use that to reconstruct the skeleton inside the GPU, and then use motion vectors which they store in a volumetric texture to tell the skeleton where to displace. And then they do a feedback shader to make sure that it oscillates and starts dampening out, which is super expensive. I mean, we're talking a naive implementation, or the pre-optimized implementation, had 20 trillion for text shader instructions per frame. So bad. Which they did some optimizations for, but it still was bad. And so they decided to, instead of doing it per vertex, you do it per instance, which means instead of doing it for every dot in the object, you just do it per object, which is a lot faster. So they create this new kind of stage. Well, they don't create a new stage, but they basically are in a blueprints to create this stage where they do a lot of the calculations for this in a compute shader per instance. And then they send the instance work to the vertices and so on. So it's much faster than it was before. And they also had a problem with source injection, which I don't quite understand. No, actually it's filling and populating their volumetric texture. Super expensive. So they basically use compute shaders to spread out the dispatch work so that things are being populated in parallel. So basically the solution for a lot of their optimizations is just parallelize it, use compute shaders, which seem like I've been hearing, like it seems like often the solution to an optimization problem is a variation of make a compute shader for it. Obviously not always, like some things compute shaders are terrible for, but GPU is really powerful, and compute shaders are just so powerful because they're so flexible. Basically they also have a special oscillation system for basically determining how you're going to shake your leaves and such. And basically they take a saw wave, convert it to a sine wave, and they have a system for dampening it by having like an on-off, increase, decrease, and then a fractional component for their current status. And they can flip back and forth between that and oscillate and get more interesting animations. For grass, they actually have this problem where with grass, there's so much detail and they're so small that actually doing it per instance is terrible. It's just too much. So counterintuitively, they go back to per vertex, which sounds like it would be even worse. But this means that they can disable foliage, like disable the animations for it, even when it's really close, because you're not going to notice it. So that saves a lot on performance, and they can just blend in and out of these interactions like that. And they even have a cool thing in their whole mapping system, because they have the bone tips and the bones. Each color channel stores the bone ID, essentially. And the alpha stores the parent bone. So root 0, everything parents from there. And you can test where the trunk of an object is by comparing its ID to its root. And if it's its own root, then you know it's the trunk. So they can do a lot of, they can basically recursively propagate animation, which is really cool. So really, really cool system. It's pretty amazing. And fast and performant. So yeah, I don't know if I would be able to recreate that myself, but very clever system. This talk was about, next talk. So at this point, for lunch, I met up with my friend Al. We work on Combined Arms together. We talked about San Francisco and stuff. And he mentions that his dad is here at GDC, and he went to dinner with him, and maybe, since he's into technical art, and he's a technical artist, he offered to go talk to him and, get us to connect us and get us to talk, which I was interested in. I would love to talk to him. Serendipity, I go to this talk, and at the end of it, I notice during it that his badge said Steve Thompson. Steve Theodore, not Thompson, Steve Theodore. Sorry, wrong last name. And I realized that's the same name as Al's, like last name is Al's. Is this his dad? And so I ask, and sure enough, that's his dad. He's right there at the front row, sitting through all of these talks. And I just spoke with him a long time about, what I do and Combined Arms and various graphics and VFX things I've been doing. He talks a bit about, good approaches and gives advice, recommends him and the guy who shows up. Other cool guy. Both are experienced VFX/graphics people. The guy who shows up, I forget his name, but I connected him with on LinkedIn. He recommends ray tracing in a weekend, which I've heard of a few times, but I think I've either been intimidated by it or something. I don't know why I never took it, but I think I'm going to sit down, do that system, and go out from there. I think that's a good way, because that's how he learned. And we talked to Steve. I talked to Steve about stuff, and he was very nice and very cool. So I'm very glad I ran into him. This next talk is about generative AI. Specifically, it's asking, okay, how useful is this right now? Right now, how useful is this? And the answer is, there are use cases. There are genuinely good use cases for machine learning in games, in tech art. That's what when people say AI, I think this is an important distinction to make, that you're talking about machine learning in usually a specific kind called large language models, which these are not quite algorithms in a traditional sense, because their consistency is more weirder. It's more based on the data you provided than the algorithm itself per se. So the people often conflate these things, and it's just wrong. It's like it's just genuinely I think a bad way to think about how this tool works. And this talk is a good example of that, because it highlights that the big issue that comes with generative AI is that it's the publicly available tools, because they're aggregating so much data, often unfiltered, terrible data. The results are often confidently terrible, or just impractical if you use it to generate full assets. Like you can make a chest. I just say make a cool chest, and it's like, oh, cool chest. But then you look at the vertex of these, and it's like the inside is filled with vertices for no reason. So stuff like that, where you try to make an asset for you, in the end you're going to have to make edits anyway, and at that point it might actually just be more work than it's worth. But it doesn't mean it's useless. His argument basically, and this talk is a bit defensive, or at least a bit on the cautious side, because of how, there's a lot of, I think, reasonable controversy around generative AI about its effects on labor. But what this is telling me, I don't think it's going to replace artists wholesale. And he basically is saying that it's not, because the cases that it would be trying to do still require someone with editorial insight who has an artistic vision and art direction to direct the scene or throw out the work if it's not relevant. And that's the key thing that matters. And the thing that you need to do for this to work is you need to make the tool, you basically need to make specialized data for your problems. So for this to work, you need to curate your data to match the kind of problems that you want to get good predictive results that the artists can direct and use. So basically his tools are his tools for judging if a generative AI thing is actually useful for you is basically what I just said. It's how is it, are your artists going to be able to use it? What problems are they noticing? What pain points is it actually addressing? Is it addressing any of them at all? So you need to get them in the room so you can make this useful to them, because they're the ones using it, not you. It's not a fun pet. It's not just your pet project. It's a tool they should be using to get cool things done. And there are great examples of using it well. One example, you can erosion. Rather than simulating expensive erosion calculations, you could speed it up by just taking a bunch of data sets for examples of erosion and then rapidly iterating through a bunch of versions to get close to the result that you would want, which will often look pretty close to what you were looking. And this was all procedural anyway. It's just you're finding an alternative, faster solution to iterate through things. Another example, which is that they use this machine learning systems for, is making it so prediction, which is very common for machine learning, used for prediction all the time. And they use machine learning, which is technically not, you could quibble about is it generative AI? I guess it is generative, because we'll explain. You take a bunch of height maps and you massage the data for these height maps, and you fill into a learning model, and it trains to use the heat maps of where players were in different levels to predict, based on the geometry of a level, where a player is going to be the most active, which can help focus your designs really quickly, so long as you're aware of the biases in the data. You have to be cognizant about what assumptions your data is making. If you have, say, a lot of very active players who constantly fight each other but never cooperate or walk past each other, you might have different heat maps and players who have different behavior, and you make those assumptions in mind. Another example, signage. You could just make, for different languages, you can train it off of specific kinds of signage and teach it to switch the languages for different signs. You know, a lot of stuff like this. And it makes me go, this kind of confirms things I've been thinking about AI, generative AI, for a while. About how it's probably going to be used, and it's not going to replace artists wholesale, I don't think, because it doesn't, unless you don't care about, like, the things it's replacing are situations where you really never cared about the quality to begin with, like when news articles are being replaced with AI, it's clear that they don't really care about the quality so much as they want quantity. They just want filler content to pad up a page for ads and to get clicks. It's like, it's good enough, but not good. And that's a problem. Like a lot of these, like, people replacing journalists and stuff, it's just that it's basically just laying bare that they don't care about quality or actually being informational, which we kind of already knew anyway. It sucks, but it's like, it's not really a surprise either. It's not that much of it's a shift, but it's not like the fundamental philosophy has changed in a way. So that, I find that interesting. Final talk, procedural tools. Basically, it's the philosophy of what tools are worth making and why you should make them. And it's all just about keeping focus and making sure that you're actually making a tool that's doing what you want it to do and isn't redundant. That's the gist of it. I could go more in detail, but I want to get this wrapped up. I want to talk about Uno. So I went to, afterwards, the Exola game night, where I hung out with first group of people. I played some Uno, and it was a very traditional kind of Uno. You take a bunch of cards when you can't pick one. It's more crab buckety, takes a while, more exhausting, not as fun, frankly. I believe I met Niche. So this card, Nicholas Johnson. Those are two people I met who I got their actual cards for. I'll put them over here. The rest, we didn't really talk that much, so I don't have much to say about them. However, the rest of the people I met were way more interesting, as I actually spoke with them more. And we played a version of Uno with some interesting rules. So we have chaining in Uno, and like it is expected, but we also can chain with +4, so it's more flexible. And we had a cool rule called turn skipping, where if someone plays a card that's identical to the card beneath it, the same card, they steal their turn, and now the turn order moves and jumps to the person next to them after they finish. So it shifts the game in a really cool way. So that already was fun. And we also went with the rule that if you can't play a card, you just draw one and don't take your turn. way better. I think that's actually the vanilla official rule. That's how it's supposed to work. Way better as a rule. Way better. But then we add a new rule where every time someone wins, they change the rules. And the people I was playing with, for context, were two people who were working on a game, I think with another person called Cozy Dungeons, Jose Abelos and Enrique Barros. I'm not a Spanish speaker. They're from Chile. All three of these people I'm holding over from Chile. This person's from Bolivia. And these two are making a game about clearing a dungeon and then renovating it and selling it. So you clear it and add furniture and Animal Crossing, like, ooh, make it really cool, and then sell it off. Very cute idea. And they worked on it, I believe, with this person as well. And he has a studio. His name is Sven von Brand. It's German. I think, I don't know. It's probably not German. What am I saying? But he made a game, or he and some of his friends worked on a game called Tormented Souls, which I've actually seen before. It was played by Indie Mouse, and he did a great playthrough of it, and he's a huge fan. And I believe also Nitrorad covered it as well. And it's a survival horror game, like a classical survival horror game, which is really cool, and it looks really good too. And they're working on like a spiritual Dead Space-esque game, but more puzzle elements, so more traditional survival horror as well right now, and they just need funding for it, along with Cozy Dungeons. Apparently he also taught in Chile about games, but they didn't pay him enough. That's a whole story. But anyway, I believe it's Jose wants to come with rules, and so those three people, the third person comes later, but they come up with this idea to add the rules. And I win around, and I add the rule where I make it more flexible. You can steal turns even if it's a different color, not the exact same card, but the same number, which means people just start stealing turns and the order shifts around and people can get confused really easily. But it makes games go so much faster, they're so much more hectic, the drama is way more intense. It's awesome. It's a much better way to play Uno. Genuinely a really fun way to play Uno. Also, the next rule that was added was that yellow is a trump card, so it's a wild card, but you can't use it to steal any other card. You can only play it on your turn, which really changes the dynamic of the game, where you have this trump card that you can always play, but you can't use it. So it shifts the balance, so you can't just constantly steal things all the time. It stops the flow a bit. Also really good rule, genuinely really good rule. And then we add another fun rule, because the same guy wins again, where if you make a mistake, I win again, and I make the rule this other guy had, Jose, where if you make a mistake, then you take the stack. Instead of just drawing a card, you make the stack. So any kind of rules mistake. So it makes you have to pay attention to the rules. And it's just really funny, and it gives you a whole bunch of cards. And it's not that big of a setback, because you can play them rapidly, like multiple cards on top of each other. And then it gets even weirder, and it adds like this alternating mechanic, which he also adds because he wins. And we add a rule where you have to, instead of saying Uno, you point at someone, you either make an animal sound or point at someone else and make an animal sound, and the animal sound has to be unique. This version was just buck wild. It was awesome. I loved it. I hung out with them at the detour afterwards. I got in a self-driving car because one of the people who was a local in the area, his name is Jean K. I don't remember the name. It's Polish. But he lives in the area. I should make sure I connect with him on LinkedIn or whatever. And he's the one who was suggesting all of these rules, I believe. Now that I think about it. Anyway, he shows at the detour. We go there, we get some beer, we get some really good pizza. And we talk about some random stuff. I learned a lot more about Chile, which has this weird healthcare system where it's partially socialized, partially privatized. It's like, it can be, basically, in the result is that it can be pretty expensive too, but it's not nearly as bad as the US healthcare system, which is kind of just a bureaucratic nightmare and a whole, I'm not going to rant about that. There's this other person I met as well, who was also in this group, Jose Gutierrez, who has a llama game that he's also trying to get funding for. Has some very cute llama designs, edge detection that I like. That was fun. He was nice. And I learned a lot more about Brazil. Not Brazil, what? Jesus. That's a completely different country. Chile. Jesus Christ. And like, for example, they talk about this city, I forget the name, but it's near Santiago. And basically it's close to it. Like, it's not that close to it. Like, if you had public transit better, it might be better, closer, but all it has is the highway, and it's kind of run down. People make fun of it. And it highlights, for whatever political reason, there's just no one has bothered to actually make good transportation. They keep making excuses. And he talked about being a teacher and not getting proper respect for his work. They're on the funding grind. They're exhibiting at the Chile booth, and I know that some other people are at the Portugal booth for TownSeek. So there's a bunch of people who are working on releasing games, needing funding, and publishers, going around. And I wish them the best. Their games look pretty good. For Jean, he has a game where it's a roguelike kind of deck builder crossed with Settlers of Catan, where you're trying to gather resources for food and trade and stuff based on certain tiles and survive across different seasons. It looked cool. But here are the cards. This is a random person I met right outside the building after we left. I didn't really talk with him that much. These are the members of the Cozy Dungeons team, which I believe Sven is a member, though it has a different personal business card. I think I would need to short my details and fact check a bit. And yeah, that covers everything. This is almost an hour long. Oops. Well, there's a lot to cover, so actually, I'm not that sorry. So yeah, I had a lot of fun. Honestly, really productive day. This is the kind of importance of I feel like I made more deeper, more interesting connections that I can hit up and follow up on and stuff. And it's a kind of spontaneous stuff that I think is fun about going to places, going to new places. So I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of this. But it's getting late. It's almost midnight, or it's past midnight actually. And I'm going to prep for bed. Tomorrow, I think I've overbooked it because the expo floor opens and I have a bunch of talks. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark which talks I want to watch in the vault. Because I have, with Summit, you have some vault access. So you can watch these later. So I think for some of the ones I missed, or will potentially miss, I'll just write them down as talk to watch later and watch them later and take notes. Yeah, I think it sounds good. That way, if I'm too tired or I need some decompression, I can give myself the space and not be super stressed. And I can explore more of the floor. Tomorrow, Thursday and Friday, I don't have as much talks, so I was having a hauling whether I just leave it those for pure exploring, but I might want to do other things rather than just the floor and other kinds of stuff. My main goal is I want to get to meeting up with Satchel and Julian, which I think since the floor reopened and I know Julian has Expo Pass, I think I should be able to at least meet them on the floor and hang out with them. So I'm going to try to do that if possible. Anyway, good night, and I will see